Sarah Mikesell with the Pig Site. I guess I just have a question, maybe Jason or Chris for you, but I'm just curious how all of this information will continue to be communicated to farmers. The information you guys are creating here is fantastic, but how are you going to get that information out to the people who really need it? I mean, we're talking about 25% of pigs that aren't making it, right? Everybody in this room, I think, probably believes that's not acceptable, and that's what you guys are your goal is. So how will all this keep coming out? Will there be another meeting like this? Will there be a portal? Will there be, I'm just throwing out the question, I guess, for somebody to kind of answer in a bigger way, that it can't stop after 5 years. This isn't going to be solved in 5 years, right?
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, right? And the way funding mechanisms for universities works is that you write a proposal for a defined period of time because a funding agency has allocated resources for a defined period of time. And we've talked about that internally as a group as well. How do you continue to do this? How do you continue to, push forward in an area that's a continuous improvement area in a defined period of time? And that's a really difficult thing to do. And I think one of the things that we need to do and be held accountable for is to make sure that we deliver on the resources that were provided to us initially, right? And so part of that is, we'll send out after this meeting to everybody that was here a survey for feedback. And what I would encourage you to do is give us honest feedback. What are the things that we're doing well? What are the things that we're missing? What are the things that we should focus on that we're not? So that we can continue to improve and get better. And then the other thing, too, as a room full of producers and allied industry partners, is to make sure that the resources, where resources can be afforded to continue to support these kinds of projects, that you're talking to those organizations, whether it's state commodity groups, National Pork Board, USDA, NEFA. Make sure that your voices are heard on where you think resources and funding should be prioritized. So that's one way to keep it going. The other thing to your question about where can we get these resources and how can we continue to get that information to producers, that's something that we continue to talk about internally as a team as well. And that's one of the things we dedicated a website to house information on. These videos and presentations from this conference will be available so that anybody in the world can see this eventually. We wanted to have a warehouse, an online warehouse and digital repository for all the information that's coming out of this project so that we can continue to have that available, not just the people that are at the conference, but to the people that, that need the information. Another part of the project that's ramping up in the second half is really in alignment with what Chris's project is the demonstration research and having folks go onto a farm and demonstrate, here's how you can be effective using this protocol, and I'll show you how to do it, and then we'll look at and evaluate the product or the results of that together, and you can see that it was effective. That's a long process, right? And that's a process that you can do a few farms like that, but then we need to have a strategy that internalizes that, and the companies internalize that and continue that training and education within their own system. That's the other thing too. You ask if there would be another conference. Is this the only one? Those are the kinds of things, if you think that this is something that brings value to the industry and that we need to do it again, I think you need to make that let us know that, right? Let us know in the feedback to this conference if that's something that you'd like to see. Because as we wrote the grant proposal, we only planned to do one conference. So if that's something you'd like to see different, then we need to hear it. So. Other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question on the pelvic organ prolapse. There's been a lot of discussion that similar genetics on different diets are different. On a corn soy diet versus a wheat barley diet, that we see differences in incidences. And some of the work you're doing there with the microbiota of the gut, of the vaginal tract, understanding that to me is one of those things that may be opening that door, at least seeing there's differences. I don't know what to do with it, but at least it shows us there's a difference. And it's exciting to me that that's there, but just wondering if there's more work headed down that path, because it does make sense that that might be the reason that we see those differences in different diets, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, Paul. And that's something that our group, we've talked about. We got Dr. Stefan Schmitz-Esther here too, who's a microbiologist, has been an essential part of our team in helping us understand, and make sense out of what we're seeing from a microbial standpoint. And, we've thought about this and we've had discussions with producers and the observations that Jamie and Zoe had, showed earlier. How do we continue to draw relevance to the industry in that? And to your point, Paul, when there's scenarios, whether it's a change in diet formulation that's associated with a change in POP, can we then go in and evaluate the vaginal microbiome and see if we see consistent differences, right, as a result of that dietary shift, right? Another one of the things that we had planned to do with the mitigation strategy on the BMD study was, if we see a response, to continue that and then evaluate, are we seeing measurable differences in the vaginal microflora that's associated with that shift in POP. Obviously, we didn't see the outcome that we were looking for, so we didn't pursue that, but other strategies that we are planning to move forward with certainly will include some of these measures that we've established, and continue to evaluate those in the context of mitigation and intervention strategies. Yeah, Kara.
Hi, Kara Stewart from Purdue. I feel like a theme I've been hearing throughout the past 2 days has been we have a little bit of a lack of standardization and information sharing. And in my personal opinion, mortality is not a trade secret, but we have the opportunities where there's variability, there's opportunity. So we have sow farms in America that have very low mortality, even within the same system that has sow farms that have high mortality. So how do we increase information sharing to know, and for academics to ask the right research questions about what is different on those farms that have low mortality from those that don't, and start to formulate the right research questions when we have such a poor lack of information sharing across the industry?
Anybody want that one? Yeah, hand it over to Dr. Dean here.
Yeah, it brings up a point that if you don't have the problem, why do you want to actually record it and be part of the study? We tend to have more emphasis on the problem herds than on the successful herds. And so to me, it's really a standardization of predictors and an industry coming together and deciding what are we going to record as an industry and stick it into our record-keeping systems. We've done well on sharing productivity records, but as Tom Stein and others have been saying for the past year, we haven't done much or changed much at all in our record-keeping system in understanding what drives those productivity and longevity factors. So my first challenge to you is, as I've mentioned, record whether or not sows are lame going into the farrowing crate as an outcome.
Yeah, John, I agree. You manage what you measure, right? I think that's a good foundational notation there.
Jeff Hansen with NutriQuest. John, I think you've made some great points. We've known each other for a lot of years, and the starting point to look at survey data is not where we need to be. I mean, that's like a death, the last thing that happened. The challenge, Kara, I think that you have to look at is individuals. These are all individuals. Everybody keeps saying that. Chris, we've got to start doing exactly what you're looking at. And proactively, you need to focus in research on how we track an individual and what happens every day in their life. Until we start finding out those trigger events, we won't know how to fix them. And that's where I'm curious, Jason, where is the project headed relative to, identifying what are individualistic things that are happening? I very much appreciated Chris's stuff this morning because that highlights that it is an individual problem.
So this fructose stuff, it's a metabolite of what?
Yeah, so it's a derivative of glucose, and so we don't, we're still trying to figure out the mechanisms of why it is just free floating, I guess, in more of the serum and in circulation. You do see a lot of changes in literature with gestational diabetes and glucose, obviously, as well as a few other inflammatory diseases, and so it's matching some of what literature already has out there with reproductive dysfunctions and disorders. So just focusing more on what it's actually doing in the sow is a big component. I think eventually if we're able to get other samples besides just serum and vaginal swabs, for example, like tissue samples, it'll be a better indicator of how and where these metabolites are coming from.
And then on this, you've identified different bacteria or in the vaginal tract, in the uterus. So instead of feeding the sow antibiotics, are you looking at infusing them with an antibiotic there?
Yeah, that's something that we're considering and trying to find the right, antibiotic to target some of these microbes that we are seeing in the high-risk sow is more of the priority, and figuring out you can't just pick any antibiotic like Jamie showed with BMD. It's an antibiotic, but it's not necessarily targeting the microbial shift that we're seeing. So picking the right one is going to be key to evaluating
Dr.
that.
Yessie's point about the diet, it's maddening though. You have two places getting the feed from the same mill, same diets, and you have this crazy difference in incidence rate. Yeah, so that's, I don't know. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, similar to like that second study, same feed mill, same diet, same everything, and Farm A had a almost 2% prolapse incident rate for the duration of our study, where Farm B had almost double that. So very interesting, just kind of making a point.
I'll just add to that a little bit too. One of the other things that we've seen, some of the other observations that fit with, energy mobilization, maybe Wayne, and along with this differences in microbial populations is, we saw the observation that there's immune cell differences, right? And perhaps those immune cells are infiltrating into tissues where there's issues. And the other component of that too is that, in our survey analysis, when we looked at body condition score, a thin sow that's under body condition has a much greater chance of prolapsing than a sow that's over body condition, which was counter to how we originally thought. We thought overweight sows would have a higher risk of prolapsing, but it's very clear that they do not. And then in the sows that are the sow farms in that survey that were intentional in bump feeding low body condition score sows, they had a reduced POP rate on their farm. And, and when you think about a microbial shift, whether we're just measuring a cause or a correlation in the vaginal microbiome, the fact that we see low body condition sows having a higher rate of prolapse, associated with that, and the fact that feeding the immune system and feeding those sows better reduces that likelihood of a prolapse, I think that's some good observations, because if you evaluate and quantify the amount of glucose that's required to elicit a strong immune response, it's ridiculous how much energy having a robust immune system takes. And then, when you go into some of the farms and we have, feed boxes that really, we need to be able to manage feed boxes, right? That's a simple thing, and make sure the individual sows are getting individual care on feed intake. And, and having that equipment and to make it easy for farm staff and caregivers to be able to manage sows individually and make it easy for them to get the feed that they need. So I think those things I think they're all related, and we're getting little pictures of the puzzle, and we're trying to put these pieces together. And sometimes, you got 20 puzzle pieces to make a 10-piece puzzle. But, and we need to figure out which ones to throw out and which ones to put together. But I do think that the immune differences that we see are related to some of the body condition differences that we see.
Ron Ketchum. I have for John Dean, just one thing I'd like to recap on this, on the reasons thing. I think we made it too complicated to try to figure out why an animal died. And as I tried to mention yesterday from your article and stuff I've talked about, is get it down to simplicity. If it's lame, it's lame. We don't have to know why. I think we got to really work at that, and the record programs and producers have got to say, let's get this simplified so we can try to figure out what's going on. So that's my comment there. Comment for you, Jason. Is there any work been done on the water study? Are you ready to say anything yet from the water study that was followed up on?
Pretty soon we will. Yeah, we're, Daniel Linares and Gustavo Silva are helping us analyze a lot of data. So we have done some additional work with water. And, you know, hopefully we'll have that in a report to put out and put up on the website here in a couple months. But, you know, that's a complicated thing to do, right? When you're getting several years worth of data and then looking at certain times where you implemented a water system and then trying to make sure that you're analyzing it right, that you're curating the data set properly. How do you account, so as an example, how do you account for a depop repop during that study in a control farm, and then a different time of the year you have a treatment farm that goes through a depop and repop, right? So those are nuances that make these studies hard, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So, there'll be more to come on that.
Yeah, Daryl Hammer. Follow up on serum. I know you took some serum samples, took blood samples in that POP study, and of course, from a biblical standpoint, you could say it's all about the blood, you know. And we know that there's cases out there that what you put in the feed, if you pull the blood, obviously whatever they fed it didn't enter, it didn't get in the blood. So what did you assay for as far as vitamins and minerals when you took those blood samples?
So with that GCMS, we were able to identify like vitamin E and a few of the other vitamins, and didn't see any differences, at least in the samples that we ran. We also evaluated trace minerals in the serum, and there's a few different ways you can analyze it. And so when you include parity, there's a little bit more effect on perineal score, but if you're just looking straight at PS1s versus PS3 on the trace mineral panel that the Iowa State D-Lab does, there weren't any significant differences. When you kind of narrow that in and look at prolapse versus non-prolapse, there are a few tendencies, but I think, again, kind of going back to get the tissues would be a better sign of that. Your serum stays pretty consistent. You're going to have to really get it out of whack feeding something to see huge differences. And the tendencies that we saw, like numerically, weren't that big of a difference, like 0.06 and 0.05. So even if you're feeding that trace mineral at a really high level, how much is 0.01 really going to change things? So working on looking at some of the other stuff in serum and trace minerals and nutritional aspects.
Hello. Kelly Keyshaw with the Hubert E. Kelb Feeds Group, and good presentations. And John, you made me think about when you talk about cross species. Within our group, we get exposed a lot to the beef side. And with lameness being a very significant problem, we've heard it time and time and time again. And I look at the beef side, and the guys have come in and spent significant dollars, anywhere from $200 to $400 a head space, to put in either Animat, Krayberg, Easy Fix, any of these type of things. And it's dramatic. I've seen it in many buildings. You'll go in, particularly when they're laying it in, the cattle with the rubber mats, 80% of them will be laying down in the pen. You go to the ones that are on concrete, 20% of them are laying down. We've taken cattle that couldn't go more than 140 days in a comfort finishing barn, and now we can put calves in there that go 240 days. It's very, very significant in what you see. It's a very significant investment. I know there's challenges as you apply it to the swine industry as opposed to beef. We have to deal with a lot of sanitation issues. The other issue is attachments and whatnot, and the people supplying rubber have done a lot better job with the attachments. But my question to the people in the room is, has anybody tried it? To what level? You know, I look at that cost and I say 200 to 400, that's on a 24 square foot per animal, and we have 1,500 pound animals on that. The other side that we found over the years is we hope when we put it in, we were hoping it'd last 4 to 7 years. It's lasting 9 years, 10 years. So I throw it out as help the industry. Somebody try it, somebody tell us what's wrong. Let's talk to these companies and see if they can overcome any shortcomings that we have. So I throw it out as an idea, a solution, or a challenge to the solution. So John, you got anything to add to that? You brought this up, so it's for that idea.
I'll speak loudly when I can.
Here you go, John.
Yeah, one of my first lessons from a dairy vet was 20 years ago or 25 years ago when we did the first round of studies on mortality and lameness. It just seems to go in generational cycles for some of us gray hairs. But I brought in a dairy vet, and the first thing he said in gestation was, boy, I thought you didn't have much problem with lameness. You never talk about it. And you've got as much lameness problems as we do in dairy. And then I took him into the farrowing house in this case, and he looked at the farrowing crate, and in this case we had woven wire floors at that point in time, and he said, what the hell? You have these lame sows and you put them on here? And so very, very much a fair comment that we haven't emphasized it, and mainly because we have a lot more replacement animals than they do, I think. As far as the response goes. But we're doing some behavioral work and just taking a look at sows getting up and down in a farrowing crate. And if they get up and down and they eat and they drink and they can do it comfortably, it's a huge predictor of future survivability in that herd. And we're just working on trying to standardize some of that.
Yeah, and there's actually been some work done at Purdue a few years ago with the G-sows and looking at different floor types and asking them what they like. And if you actually do give them a rubber mat after they have eaten and done their drinking and all that good stuff, they will choose to predominantly lay down on that. One to one, right? One mat to one sow. So there is some work in the literature, at least in the small research farms, right? But taking it out commercially, that's a whole different consideration that really hasn't been dug into yet. Okay.
Roger Arnson from Malenko. So the question is have we lost the concept of good stockmanship? You know, when I was a kid, you took care of each sow individually, and have we lost that? The other question is on the microbiota parameters, the blood parameters measures. Are they causes or the effects? And I think they may be effects. Something is going wrong with that sow, and it starts way before those blood parameters are measured. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so I think on the stockmanship issue, I think that's something that's hard for me to gauge that, right? Because I'm not in there evaluating people's stockmanship. You know, sometimes, you know, I do think, though, Roger, to your point, that maybe the answers are more obvious, right? And so I was just sitting there thinking, like, maybe sometimes I feel like we're trying to use a scalpel to cut down a tree. And, you know, and we just need to step back, and maybe it's something more simple than that, and that we're measuring what we're measuring is, to your point, just a correlation or an effect of the underlying cause. And so when we're using really refined laboratory methods and evaluating these things, but can we shift that and show that that it's not an issue, right? So we're using a scientific approach, right? And you're seeing, you know, some really unique biology that I think is still really important, because that is helping us demonstrate, if it is and comes back to anything that's related to stockmanship, right? We'll understand the biology and the importance of certain aspects of stockmanship and how they're affected. So, and the other thing I was just thinking regarding that, and I was trying to tie some things back into yesterday's conversation. I'd be interested to hear what people think about this. But considering, a model farm, right? And I know I've been on some farms, and I've been on recently and on retrofits where very intentional, right, to create designs around farms to make it easier for caregivers to walk pen to pen, right? So if it's important to see the sows every day and make sure they get up, it's a lot easier to do that walking through the pen than walking along the side of the pen. And, so I think those are some things that I've seen, even in retrofits, that companies are doing to make it easier for caregivers to provide better individual sow care. Now, is that the whole answer? I don't know. But thinking about Larry Coleman's conversation yesterday is maybe we need to think about how to design a farm. What's all the technology that can provide opportunities to demonstrate what ideal stockmanship would be, and what is ideal stockmanship, right? And having those conversations as well, and just designing a farm and a program that we think we could have minimal mortality, right? And then see, does it work? So that's a big investment to do something like that, but maybe there's opportunities there. Does anybody else in the room have, it's a good question. Does anybody else have ideas, perspectives on stockmanship? Right. Just reprioritizing things, and what, we talk about that a lot too. It's been already said today, what you measure is what you change. So yeah.
Hi, Janelle Dunkelberger. I just had a question or a comment for you, Jason, to follow up on your request for ideas or thoughts for future research projects. It really struck me during your presentation that the highest incidence group for those animals that were developing prolapse was your gilts to your P2s. So that really seems to indicate that there's something that's not ideal in terms of developing that animal. So is there any work or plans focusing on looking at what are those factors during gilt development about setting up that animal for success? Because it appears that there's something lacking throughout that gilt development process, that she's not getting up to a good start once she becomes a sow. And maybe even before that, in terms of what are different factors during development of that gilt during gestation. Is there something such as a disease challenge or inflammatory challenge that the sow is experiencing that's somehow creating an imbalance or deficiency for that piglet already before she's even born?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff you just said right there. That's really good points. I think, or at least there's a lot of things that went through my head as you were saying that, but really good points. And I think with respect to the early parities, I think part of that's parity structure on the farms, right? There's just, as we saw yesterday, there's just so much turnover in P1s and P2s, so they represent a bigger part of the farm, and they represent a higher percentage of the prolapses as a result. One of the things, to your point on gilt development, I think that is a really important area, and I don't claim to know. Maybe there's probably people in this room that know more than I do in that. I'm sure there's people in this room that know more than I do in that area. But I will say that, you know, a lot of times we're using a huge percentage of our available gilts to become sows. And I think that that's not necessarily ideal. And, you know, because we don't know all of the markers and all of the things that have happened biologically to that gilt that's going to affect her lifetime and her lifetime productivity. So one example in humans, right, was diethylstilbestrol, was given to women to prevent miscarriages in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And what they realized when daughters of mothers that were given diethylstilbestrol to prevent miscarriages reached puberty and started producing their own endogenous estrogen, they had a dramatically higher probability of developing cervical cancer, right? And it was because of this exposure that had happened in their first trimester of gestation, put them at high risk for cervical cancer when they reach puberty. So to your observation, Danelle, I think that's very possible, right? That there's things that are happening after conception, you know, that at conception, that pig has the most genetic potential it's ever going to have in its life. And everything that happens to it, either in gestation or at day one care or prior to weaning, or how we develop that gilt after weaning until she's bred and until she's gone through her first parity, everything we do, if we don't do it really, really well, we're taking away from the genetic potential of that sow, right? And that goes back to conception. So how do we embrace that and go after that? I think one of the things, one idea is that we need to have a larger available pool of gilts in the industry that become sows. Breed target is such a key piece of how sow farms operate, and making sure that we hit breed target. And if you ask somebody if do you want good gilts or you got to hit breed target is always going to get hit. And I think we try to use so many gilts that maybe we need to back up and start producing way more gilts than we need, so that we can get some information and start using some of the work that in lameness that Ken Stalder's been working on and others have been working on. And, Matt Ramosier has done some studies that just evaluating gilts vulva size at 15 weeks of age, the bottom 20% of those gilts on one measure produce one pig less through two parities, and a smaller percentage of them are still in the herd at two parities. Well, if you're trying to use 95% of those available gilts, you can't glean those bottom 20% out very well. And so I think, we just need to continue to back up and say, how does the supply chain for production work, right? From gilt development through weaned pigs, and evaluate how are we getting the resources, are we developing those resources, and when I say resources, gilts, in a manner that we're optimizing their genetic potential for the rest of their life.
Yeah, I guess I get a mic. I'm following up on Roger's comments, actually, and it's really great work to see what you've done on microbiome. I'm wondering if you're going to take it in a direction of virome also. I mean, what we have in those tissues is probably a lot different when we're working with the size of farms that we have, and the level of production that those pigs are at. It seems like what you're seeing is with LBP being down and some of the lymphocytes being changed, is we're catching something there. There's an infectious process at least, and could it possibly be initiated by possibly virus status of those sows and in those tissues?
I'm looking at Dr. Smith-Esser here. Is that something you'll be able to see with the shotgun sequencing?
Well, what Zoe mentioned briefly, so what we are doing right now is metagenome shotgun sequencing of those vaginal samples. So we are sequencing all the DNA that is in those samples, get rid of all the pig host DNA, and we'll analyze all what is remaining. So we will be able, and we'll surely be looking into at least DNA-based viruses. We don't have RNA from those samples, so that will at least potentially give us some potential insight, or if there are, other potential pathogens. So we are not confined to looking into bacteria. So from that perspective, we hope to learn some new stuff, if that may be something to consider.
Thanks, Eric. Good comment.
Mandy Dutton with Professional Swine Management. I had a question back on the prolapse study. Did you guys note any correlation of tail length on perennial scores?
We did measure a lot of tails on that initial survey, and we did not see anything that was associated with pelvic organ prolapse. We also tried to measure, the distance between the anus and the vulva as well. And one of the problems with that is that that's very confounded by the perineal score, right? How swollen it is. So that didn't work really well at the time point in late gestation that we were taking that. I think if we were going to do something like that again, you'd want to measure it not in late gestation.
Yeah, Paul Yeske. A couple comments first. I agree on your guilt comment, Jason. We get to the point of even having breeding barrows show up, so that's when the selection pressure is high. The other comment is, all I want is a simple probiotic on the AI rod, so I get the right culture or the right flora when I breed the sow. And the other comment that I would make that's a little more serious is, you've got the blood parameters. Can you go back and look at some of the liver enzymes just to see if there's changes there that may be resulting in some of that pre-diabetic or gestational diabetic? Because there are some issues also with lactation in that, as well as if you're in a pre-diabetic state going into farrowing. And so there may be some keys there that may be a part of that thing.
Yeah, good point, good observation, Paul, and I see Zoe's writing that down. So we do have some samples left from the studies we have, but we'll probably be collecting some more on future studies as well.
Again, another thing that in dairy cattle, they have certain calving difficulties, DAs and that sort. I think we could look at nutritionally some of the things that they've done in dairy cattle and apply those to pigs. That possibly a good thing. The other thing is, as we have increased number of pigs born, that just puts more pressure on that sow. And so if we outkick the coverage in terms of that a sow being able to not have a POP. And so the question is, and we may not know what to select for in gilts. A gilt may not be able to be developed not to have one. And so what criteria that we could select for of that gilt to be able to be preventive of a POP? And we might not know what that is. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I don't think we know what that is necessarily as far as selecting for a sow that does not have a POP. I will just say, though, I have been on sow farms, right? And you walk in, and you just see some super healthy sows, and they got 19 good-sized piglets that were just born and no stilt. You look at the sow card, and it's just amazing that she had 19 large, healthy pigs, and they're all running around the crate nursing, and they all look good, and she's laying there, and, just a great mother. Just an example of how that there is on farm super, super productive sows, right? And right next to it's one that's super high risk for prolapse, right? And so just trying to, I don't think they're all, this is not a problem that every sow's afflicted with. I think some of the, so to your comment about have we gotten sows to where they have these massive capabilities, is that a problem? And I think some of the most productive sows on the farm are the healthiest sows on the farm. And so, So I think that we can tolerate super productive sows. We just got to figure out how to manage it a little bit better and how to protect them from maybe some risks, right? So maybe it's like having a Ferrari's engine in a Oldsmobile Intrigue, right? The Oldsmobile is a nice car, but you know, you're not going to be able to fully experience the effects of an engine that belongs in a Ferrari when you put it in a different car that doesn't have the rest of the pieces. And actually then things will start to break. So that normally wouldn't break.
Yeah, I am Juan Carlos Pinilla with PIC. So this is more than a question, it's a reflection, you know, trying to connect different dots. Things that were said today, other things that were said yesterday. So people is fundamental, you know, in solving these sow mortality issues. Nobody will save sows but the people that is in the farm, you know, and I feel like the industry over the last several years has spent a lot of time, energy, and resources educating everybody in how to do a safe euthanasia. But we haven't spent the same amount of time, resources, and energy in educating the staff in how to save sows. I don't think we are going to find the right path if we don't change that. Just a reflection.
Very good, thank you.
Chris Sparks, Shiva Pharma. Good comment there, and to follow up with that, you know, we're looking at the labor has been one of the big things we've talked about, and then we look at, you're talking about microbiome changes. Chris is talking about having somebody do the simplest thing to see if a sow gets up and treating it. Well, when I was in undergrad, I did a boatload of estrus detection on gilts. I got good enough that I could see a gilt coming in heat the day before she came in heat. In fact, University of Missouri got mad at me because all the gilts were coming in a day before they were actually cycling. And I was a day ahead always. Why can't we find somebody that can see a sow getting sick before she won't get up? And it seems like we have a chronic case going on bacterial, because they're working, when Chris has them treated, they're responding. They're not dying. So it seems like it's a chronic bacterial infection. What's causing that, I don't know, but we're inserting AI rods. Are they contaminated? We're sleeving. We sleeve the gilts more than we do anybody else. When are we contaminating these girls?
Yeah, I think those are good observations, Chris. And I don't know when the time frame might be that they're exposed, but I think you make a really good point about, you know, something being obvious once you see it, right? As you're saying that, it reminds me of like those ink blot things you see, right? And it's like you're supposed to be looking for something and you just can't see it. It just doesn't make sense, doesn't make sense, doesn't make sense. And then you realize, oh, there's a lamp there or whatever it is, right? And it's like, then you can't not see it, right? Once you see it, you can't not see it. And I think that's part of it, part of the issue, right? It's like, well, we're just not looking at it right. We're not seeing it right. And I see Wayne's in here. Wayne Cass always loves a good story, so I'm going to tell a story because I think some of you have heard this, some of you have not. Does anybody know who Ignaz Semmelweis is? Okay, these guys do. They've heard me tell the story. So he was a Hungarian doctor that oversaw two maternity wards in Vienna, Austria in the 1850s. And during the time, these two clinics were for training doctors at the time. And he started making these observations that the death rate on women after they had their babies was super high from puerperal fever. And so what happened, though, is just like, it reminds me of two sow farms, right? You got two maternity wards, and one of them, the mortality rate was twice as high as the other one. And it was also at a maternity ward that was next to a morgue, where these doctors in training were working at the morgue and working with cadavers as well. Well, the death rate on these women got so high at the one clinic that they would quit going into the hospital and have the babies in the street and then go in with the babies so they could still get the postnatal care that the hospital offered. And what Semmelweis noted was that the death rate of the women having the baby in the street and then going into the hospital matched what the other clinic had. And then he started realizing that the physicians were coming over from handling cadavers and delivering babies and weren't washing their hands. And so he started forcing them to wash their hands with a disinfectant when they came from the morgue, which they all thought was ridiculous, and the death rate dropped precipitously. Right? So then he started going to conferences and telling everybody, you need to wash your hands, you need to wash your hands. You guys are killing people with what's underneath your fingernails. And they thought he was crazy. Even other physicians and his wife had him put into an insane asylum where eventually he got beaten and died of sepsis. And it wasn't until later that Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease, where he was really vindicated, and now we know you should wash your hands, right? And so he's actually considered the father of washing your hands, right? An aseptic technique. But it's obvious to us now, right? It's obvious. They thought he was crazy because of the observations he was making. And I think there's things like that that we're not seeing. We have to look at something differently. I said that yesterday, right? To get out of a problem, you have to be thinking differently than you were thinking when you got into it. And so, that would just be the biggest challenge I would say to everybody at this entire conference is just we have to think differently than how we've been thinking the last 4 or 5 years. And the opportunities for someone that thinks differently and that can innovate, they're going to capture value quicker.
Yep. Karen Talbot from High Life. I do have a thinking differently, maybe idea. Maybe it's been done. One thing we've been looking at, so following all the good work you're doing, guys, on sow mortality, we were doing a lot of necropsies on farm and thought it was very inefficient, and we could not see enough. You cannot be there enough. So we decided to go with slaughter check. Now I know those sows are not dead, and they're healthy, and they're not lame. So it has a limitation. But one thing, we found 2 very interesting things, and I was wondering if anyone else have done that. So the rate of ulcer in sows was significant. And it varies by female. We're following 3 females right now, so there might be something there. So that was one thing we're looking at. And the other one was bladder health. We were shocked. Actually, we were not looking at bladder at first, as my student eventually says, something is wrong with those bladder. And she started collecting them, sending them to the lab. And we found a lot of inflammation and infection. And those sows look healthy, at least they make it to the cold market, but I was wondering if this is something anyone has looked into.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's really important. Is that something anybody else has looked at and has made some observations? Anybody want to share?
Agreed. So necropsies are very difficult to do, very time, labor intensive. Oh, you're right there. I was looking at you on the screen. So the slaughter check would be I think, a very good idea. We have not seen as many ulcers as you described, but the bladder issue. The other thing that we've seen in pop sows is a tremendous amount of volume of fluid in the abdomen and in the uterine area, up to 5 to 10 gallons of fluid. And we've done some bacteriology to see if we really haven't found anything, but when we have a prolapse, there's a tendency when you catch them fresh enough, and sometimes if you see them dragging them to the transition room to remove, you'll see that fluid be gone. It won't be there because it's flowing out, but I don't know what that means, but the bladder health and that interstitial, or just that fluid in the abdomen and in the reproductive tract and in the bladder, is something that we've seen as well.
Thank you, Noel. We're right at 10, but Dr. Ross just said we could have maybe one more question, so you will close us out. Thank you.
Kind of coming off what you said, Jason, the thinking differently, have you guys ever worked with, well, we've heard people talk about the dairy industry, but have you ever worked with like human health doctors and had them come in and kind of look at the process to see if there's things they see? I mean, we've heard a couple bit different people talk about this connection, right? I mean, John talked about it too in his talk about human health being so connected, and the ladies were talking about you know, a lot of female reproductive stuff, right? Maybe bring in an OBGYN who's a human health doctor to kind of look at this whole process and see, just thinking outside the box off of what you said, of looking outside the industry and having somebody who doesn't have all the preconceived notions that some of the folks in this room probably has, to consider a different view or a different point of view. Just an idea.
Excellent. Thank you.
I haven't done that, but yeah, I think you make a good point. Anytime that you can take somebody's thoughts or perspectives that are different and then evaluate that through their lens, what you're doing is probably going to be beneficial. You know, I have thought about Drake University has an actuarial sciences program, right? And could we get enough data to somebody like that to say, if we were going to insure our sows, how would you calculate the premium? What is the information that you would want to know if you were going to calculate the premium on a sow's life that we would have to pay? And then what are the measures, right, that we can do to reduce that premium? And just, you know, give them, here's the information and data we have. Can you come up with a fee structure, a premium structure? You know, and maybe they would say, well, that's only 80% of what we need. We need this X, Y, and Z. Well, then maybe we need to start measuring X, Y, Z and not A, B, C. So.